October 2025 has proven to be quite eventful when it comes to the subject of gruesome deaths and murders, with countless people having committed or having been sentenced for the despicable act of murder. And so, I have gone through and chosen 16 of the most brutal, shocking and downright despicable murderers to showcase to you in this video, being careful to choose cases that were not always reported nationally, and so knowing that you will most probably not have heard of some, if not most, of these cases. From a male porn star who murdered and dismembered two kind and caring men for nothing more than his own financial gain, to a 15-year-old boy who masterminded a murder in order to get back at his ex-friend over a petty squabble. These cases truly were the most shocking I had come across, and they were all committed by murderers who were either sentenced or found guilty of the act in October 2025. Hello and welcome to the Diary of Madmen and Monsters, where we talk about the mad men, women and monsters that inhabit our society, covering well-known and not so well-known cases across the UK and beyond. And if your ideal life mantra is eat, sleep, true crime, repeat, then you're in the right place and you're going to fit in well. Now, let's get ready because it's time for more true crime. In the early hours of a summer night in Bristol, two large suitcases lay abandoned on the Clifton Suspension Bridge, one slowly leaking a dark, ominous stain onto the pavement. Passers-by were horrified to discover human remains inside those bags, the dismembered body parts of two elderly men. Within days, detectives traced the clues back to a flat in Shepherd's Bush, West London. The victims, 62-year-old Albert Alfonso and his 71-year-old partner, Paul Longworth, had been brutally murdered in their own home. Police found that prior to their deaths, the couple had been hosting a housemate, 35-year-old Yostin Andres Mosquera, a Colombian national and pornographic performer who had been having a sexual relationship with Albert, and who Albert had invited to stay with the couple whilst visiting the city. At first glance, he seemed harmless, but soon the truth would emerge as one of the most horrific crimes investigators had ever seen. Flashback to mid-July 2024. The flat was ordinary, the London night quiet. In the afternoon, Mosquera approached Paul Longworth in their bedroom. Sidling up alongside him, Mosquera suddenly leapt into action, viciously hitting him over the head with a hammer, bludgeoning him unconscious, then placing a plastic bag over his head and suffocating him to death. CCTV showed Mosquera closing the curtains, working with grim efficiency as the elder man took half an hour to die. After murdering Paul, he then placed his body underneath a bed and waited to enact the second part of his plan. Later that evening, Albert Alfonso returned home from work, unaware that Mosquera had set a gruesome trap. When Alfonso walked in, Mosquera, who greeted him in his usual friendly manner, initiated a sexual encounter, waiting for Alfonso to get into a compromising position, then suddenly grabbed a knife he had hidden beneath a cloth on the table and plunged it into Alfonso's neck. Albert fought back as best he could, but being caught unaware by a younger, stronger man put him at a massive disadvantage. And try as he might to defend himself, unfortunately the blows were fatal. In chilling detail, Mosquera even recorded the murder on camera, filming himself committing the gruesome and evil acts in 4K and dancing around the room after committing the crime. When it was all over, two loving lives had been abruptly snuffed out. With the victims dead, Mosquera's true motive surfaced: greed and desperation. He immediately began looting their finances. He sat at Albert's computer, desperately typing, trying to transfer money from the elderly couple's bank accounts to his own. He searched online for a chest freezer and made multiple searches into how long a corpse takes to decompose. Detectives later found Mosquera's laptop filled with sinister queries: how to hide a body, where to strike to kill, even plans to sell the couple's flat. The judge in the case later determined these murders were undoubtedly committed for gain. Overnight on the 10th of July 2024, Mosquera decided to try and cover up his crime. He methodically began to dismember the men, then loaded some of the dismembered body parts into suitcases and vanished. Less than a couple of hours later, an alert member of the public confronted a strange man acting oddly on the Clifton Bridge, one suitcase oozing blood onto the ground. Mosquera bolted, leaving the luggage behind. Police arrived to make a grim discovery. The body parts of Paul and Albert were scattered inside. Clues in the luggage led officers straight to Shepherd's Bush. There, at the victim's own flat, officers found the rest of the remains, decapitated heads and frozen limbs in the chest freezer. 3 days later, on the 13th of July, officers cornered Mosquera at Bristol Temple Meads train station and arrested him without incident. Under questioning, he attempted a bizarre defence, claiming one victim killed the other and he lost control, but prosecutors peeled back the lies. Forensics had captured Mosquera's every dark step. Hours of CCTV, the blood-stained suitcases, the freezer, even the online searches and videos. Witnesses had described meeting Mosquera through gay dating sites where he lured his victims, and it was here he had met the unfortunate pair he would go on to kill. In a stunned courtroom at Woolwich Crown Court, the full horror was spelled out. Jurors saw the video recordings of Albert's murder and learned that Mosquera had also been caught with a cache of child abuse images on his personal laptop. The judge showed no mercy. In October 2025, Jostin Andres Mosquera was sentenced to life in prison with a minimum term of 42 years. The judge described the murders as premeditated and thoroughly wicked, warning that Mosquera might never leave prison. For Albert and Paul's grieving family and friends, the nightmare had an end, but the cruel memory of what Mosquera did would haunt them forever. Spring sunshine bathed the cobbled streets of Huddersfield on the 3rd of April 2025, but one moment would forever darken the day. 16-year-old Ahmad al-Ibrahim, a slight boy who had fled war-torn Syria, walked calmly with a friend through the busy town centre. Ahmad had arrived in England only weeks before, dreaming of becoming a doctor to help his sick mother. But on this bright afternoon, his path crossed with danger. Ahead of Ahmad strolled 20-year-old Alfie Franco, his 18-year-old girlfriend and some friends. Franco, it later emerged, had spent the day on drugs, cannabis, cocaine, ketamine, diazepam and codeine, and was already irritable. Nothing about Ahmad threatened them, but when Ahmad accidentally brushed past Franco's girlfriend as they walked by, Franco took instant petty exception. He spun Ahmad around, said something heated and lured the teenager closer with threats. CCTV would capture Ahmad gently insisting no trouble, turning back towards Franco after a brief exchange. But Franco was beyond reason. He had a flick knife hidden in his pocket. In a flash, he whipped it out and drove it into Ahmad's neck. The blade sliced deep. Ahmad staggered, clutched his throat and collapsed into a pool of his own blood. By the time his friend realised the gravity of the wound and screamed for help, it was far too late. Chaos erupted. Bystanders and the police rushed to Ahmad's side. Despite frantic first aid, Ahmad lost consciousness and was raced by ambulance to hospital. Emergency doctors fought valiantly, but the wound was catastrophic. It had severed Ahmad's major blood vessels. 2 days later, in a Leeds hospital, Ahmad succumbed to his injuries. Word of Ahmad's death sent shockwaves through Huddersfield's small refugee community. His family in Swansea, who had watched him make the harrowing 3-month journey from Homs to Britain, were devastated. Ahmad had imagined Britain as the land of peace and dreams, one uncle would later say, only to have life snatched away so brutally and senselessly. Police swung into action. The killer was quickly identified as Alfie Franco, who had been arrested nearby minutes after the stabbing. At Leeds Crown Court, the truth came out. Franco had carried the knife with him, ready to wield it with no provocation. He brazenly claimed self-defense, even alleging Ahmad had a weapon, a lie flatly rejected by the evidence. CCTV showed Ahmad with empty hands, and Franco's own words heard on camera revealed his cold intent. Ahmad's grieving parents could not be in court. He had left them in Syria to find safety abroad, but hundreds heard his story through statements. Prosecutors called this an unprovoked, passionless and inexplicable act of violence. Judge Howard Crossan told Franco that upon seeing Ahmad, he identified him as a target and lured him before killing him. On the 10th of October 2025, Alfie Franco was convicted of murder and immediately sentenced to life with a minimum term of 23 years. Ahmad's uncle, Ghazwan al-Ibrahim, read out the boy's farewell message to the world, that he thought he had found hope in Britain, but instead fell victim to a senseless and unprovoked act of violence. In a quiet street of Garden City, Deeside, life for 2-year-old Ethan Ives Griffiths should have been a loving, carefree and enjoyable experience with his grandparents and mother. Instead, what happened to Ethan became a nightmare no family can ever forget. In August 2021, the little boy moved into the home of his grandparents, Michael and Curry Ives, to start a new life with them and his mother, Shannon Ives. But behind closed doors, he faced something unimaginable. Investigators later uncovered hundreds of hours of home video and CCTV showing that Ethan was singled out for relentless abuse and neglect. His own grandparents treated him as an object for humiliation, forcing him to stand in punishment, weeping as others were told to beat him, even pointing a hose at him and ordering other children to punch him. The three even allowed Ethan to cry out for food and water while they all stood by, showing callous indifference to his suffering. Day by day, Ethan grew weaker. Hospital doctors would later describe him as dangerously dehydrated and underweight, with about 40 bruises and injuries covering his small body. One commented that his wounds were akin to a high-speed car crash injury. It was even found that just 2 days before the final disgusting blow, Ethan's granddad Michael had hit him so hard he had been knocked unconscious for several minutes, but that no medical attention was sought by anyone. Instead, they simply waited for him to come around and then carried on as normal, taking him on a shopping trip to Tesco later that day as if nothing had happened. On the evening of the 14th of August 2021, tragedy struck. In the Ives household's living room, with Shannon upstairs on the phone, 48-year-old Michael and 46-year-old Curry Ives inflicted the final blow on Ethan, a crushing strike to his tiny head. The force was savage. Doctors later testified that this impact, a deliberate, powerful blow, was fatal. Ethan collapsed almost immediately and did not regain consciousness. 18 harrowing minutes passed before Curry finally called an ambulance. By then, it was too late. Paramedics found Ethan unresponsive. He was rushed to Alder Hey Children's Hospital, but 2 days later, on the 16th of August 2021, Ethan quietly died. He was only 27 months old, a desperate child with his whole life ahead of him, killed by those who were supposed to protect him. In the wake of Ethan's death, police launched a full investigation. Michael and Curry lied to officers, even blaming their own daughter, and claimed Ethan had simply fainted while watching TV. But forensic evidence and testimonies told another story. Doctors' notes showed Ethan's body ravaged, skull fractures, brain bleeds, bruises, healed injuries from repeated beatings, all consistent with the abuse the cameras captured. Social workers also revealed Ethan had been on a child protection plan and was already listed as neglected. On the 15th of July 2025, a jury at Mould Crown Court delivered its verdict. Michael and Curry Ives were found guilty of murder. Shannon Ives was found guilty of causing or allowing Ethan's death, with CCTV showing her simply standing by, watching and sniggering as her evil parents doled out vile punishments and encouraged other children to abuse Ethan. On the same day, All three evil individuals were also convicted of child cruelty. Emotions ran high as Ethan's family in court described a boy who had always been happy before being left to suffer so much pain. On the 3rd of October 2025, sentencing brought grim closure. Judge Colin Ikram delivered life sentences to the grandparents. Michael Ives would serve a minimum of 23 years, Curry a minimum of 17. Shannon Ives was sentenced to 12 years for the cruelty of allowing her child to die. The detectives had pieced together the final story. Ethan was beaten until his brain was crushed, starved until he was the weight of a toddler half his age, then left alone to die. Ethan's memory would live on in the justice they finally received, a harsh reminder of how much love a child deserves and how cruelly a family could fail him. For 27-year-old Antonis Antonidis, a visit to London in July 2024 should have been an exciting adventure shared with friends. Unfortunately, due to the evil intentions of a group of small-time street thugs, it turned into a nightmare. Antonis, a cheerful young Greek man, spent a Saturday night out dancing near Oxford Circus. At dawn, his group piled into a taxi for the ride back to their flat in New Cross. They had no idea the trouble was tracking them every mile of the way. Unknown to Antonis, a gang of 5 young men had been prowling central London all night, hunting for potential prey. The gang had spotted Antonis and focused in on his Lacoste man bag and designer Versace watch, and, in a stolen car, followed Antonis and his group for 8 miles after they left the nightclub at 8:15 AM on the 7th of July 2024. The gang wore ski masks and carried weapons in order to inspire as much fear as possible into their victims. And so, when Antonis and his friends stepped out of the taxi at Florence Terrace in New Cross, South East London, 4 of those men, Sophia Alice, Shane Johnson, Joshua McCorkdale and 18-year-old Alfie Hipple, pounced. The attackers approached Antonis at speed as his friend struggled to find the keys to open the door. Launching an unprovoked attack, the rabid gang began to punch and kick Antonis as they grabbed at his belongings. Feeling threatened by the gang's actions, Antonis did the only thing he felt he could. He fought back, lashing out at one of the robbers, catching him a glancing blow across the head with a brandy bottle. In that desperate scuffle, one of the thieves pulled out a large knife and drove it into Antonis's chest. Then another of the gang members pulled out a second knife and slashed Antonis's thigh wide open, splashing blood everywhere in the process. The second blade, used with evil intentions, cut through Antonis's femoral artery, causing rapid, life-threatening blood loss. Realising what they had done, the group quickly scuttled off and made their getaway, joining the 5th member of their dastardly gang in the awaiting car, where 17-year-old Amin Alice was waiting as getaway driver. Antonis fought for his life despite the trauma. He survived long enough to be rushed to the hospital. Doctors later said he had bled out so badly that he needed emergency surgery. Friends held a vigil at his bedside, but the injuries were too severe. 2 weeks later, on the 21st of July 2024, Antonis died of his wounds, tragically never returning home to Greece. London detectives now faced a daunting investigation. There were no eyewitnesses in the dark street, and the killers had disappeared. But police painstakingly spent hours sifting through mobile phone records, cell site data and CCTV, tracing the taxi's long route through London and watching the gang's car following from Camden to New Cross. Using said footage, investigators identified the car as a Kia Sportage, which was using fake number plates, and tracked its movements back to one of the gang members' homes. Forensic teams recovered the stolen vehicle, hidden under a car blanket. It was covered in Antonis's blood and the gang members' DNA. Upon arresting and then searching the homes of each man, police found a myriad of weapons such as machetes, swords and knives alongside the balaclavas used in the attack, with each piece of evidence found tightening the net around the suspects. On the 1st of August 2025, after an intense trial at the Old Bailey, the 5 men were convicted of murder and robbery conspiracy. Their plans for quick cash had turned to murder. Sentencing day brought retribution. Amin Alice, now 18, was given 22 years. Sophia Alice, 20, got 25 years. Shan Johnson, 26, received 28 years. Joshua McCorkdale, 20, got 26 years. And Alfie Hipple, 18, got 23 years. All terms must run concurrently for murder, reflecting how each man took part in the killing of this young tourist. Through the glass, Antonis's parents listened in horror as their son's killers were named and punished. In a statement, they mourned. The loss of our child, so unjust and inhumane, has left us devastated. The wound that has opened in our life will never heal. It was the early hours of Sunday the 16th of March 2025 on Barlow Drive in Stannington, Sheffield. A family home was about to erupt in violence. Inside lived 45-year-old Michael James, his ex-partner Zara Tolley, and their 2 sleeping children. Also present that night was 35-year-old Bradley Hollis, Zara's new boyfriend, an ex-friend of Michael's and the man Zara had called off her engagement to Michael to be with. The stage was set, a love triangle, months of jealousy and a tragic ending. Tensions had simmered for weeks. Social services had ordered Zara to keep Bradley out of the house after Michael's earlier outbursts. Michael had warned Zara in violent text messages, "If that wanker comes anywhere near my kids, I'll kill you both," he wrote, with chilling menace. On this March evening, Zara defied the order, and Bradley turned up at the front door, hoping to spend time with her. Their words that night quickly escalated. Michael, huffing with rage and possibly drunk, began a vicious assault upon Zara. First, he grabbed her by the arm and punched her full force in the face repeatedly. Next, still furious at the disrespect he felt he had been shown, he grabbed a vodka bottle and struck out, smashing it over Zara's head in the living room. Brutal chaos followed. Bradley, seeing the attack on Zara, lunged to intervene. Climbing in through an open window, he threw himself at Michael, looking to protect his girlfriend's honour. Michael, blinded by fury, whipped out a hidden knife. In less than 2 minutes, he plunged it repeatedly into Bradley's body. One blow found Bradley's chest, a wound so deep that it pierced his heart, snapping the sternum in two, according to the pathologist. Others cut into his shoulders and ribs. Bradley tried to struggle, but then crumpled to the floor, bleeding heavily. Below the bedroom where Zara's children slept, sirens soon wailed. Neighbours had called 999. Paramedics arrived within minutes, frantically treating Bradley's wounds. Battling his injuries in a desperate attempt to save him, paramedics tried in vain, realising their attempts were futile. One paramedic was heard speaking in hushed tones. "He's gone," as his life slipped away on the living room floor. Bradley Hollis was pronounced dead at 3:39 a.m. that morning. Michael James immediately fled the scene, disappearing into the pre-dawn darkness. He was later found hiding in a shed in the nearby Riverland Valley, apprehended and handcuffed by police.
Show us your hands!
Show us your hands now!
Out!
Out!
Now!
It's on your head! Get on the ground! Get on the ground!
Lay out with your hands out in front of you. Do not move.
Your side now.
Do not move.
Do not move! Someone come in for cuffs. Do not move!
Cover on. Do not move your hands.
The next 2 years led to a Sheffield Crown Court showdown. In court, a portrait of a broken man emerged. Michael had been living in the family home even after losing Zara, screaming threats about his children's safety, unable to let go. He even admitted on the stand that he had struck Zara with the bottle before the fatal fight. The jury was also shown the menacing messages. Bradley should be dead in a box like his mum, or burnt, one read. Bradley's mother, Amanda, had been murdered by her ex 17 years earlier, another heartbreak in the Hollis family. On the 15th of October 2025, the jury delivered their verdict. Michael James was not guilty of murder, but guilty of manslaughter. The court heard how the jealousy and rage had spiralled, and it had ended in a harrowing death, but the jury were not convinced that the evidence had met the requirements to convict Michael of murder. Senior Detective Inspector Thomas Woodward said afterward that James had delivered devastating injuries before fleeing in a cowardly attempt to avoid consequences, possibly hinting at the fact that he wasn't convinced the jury had made the right decision. The following day, Judge Graham Reed sentenced Michael James. He handed down 14 years imprisonment, with the judge noting the horrific nature of the attack that tore apart one more family. On the night of April 15th, 2025, the quiet of Knowsley Heights in Huyton, Merseyside, was torn apart by a horror no one saw coming. No one, except maybe Rebecca Campbell. Rebecca was 32 years old. By all accounts, she was warm, full of life, and trying to move on from a volatile relationship. That relationship was with Michael Ormondy, a 34 years old drug dealer and former cage fighter with a violent past and a hair-trigger temper. The couple had only been together for a few months, having met in an Irish bar 4 months prior. Neighbours and friends would later describe a relationship that felt tense, unstable, and increasingly paranoid. That night, Rebecca was home alone in her flat. The air was still, her television flickered behind the curtains. She had no idea she was being hunted, not by a stranger, but by the man she had once let through her front door. Sometime around 10:30 p.m, Michael Ormondy arrived outside her flat, but he didn't come for conversation. He didn't come to make amends. He came armed and wearing a bulletproof vest, as though expecting war, as though already imagining how he might survive it. As Rebecca spoke on the phone to her best friend, the front door to her apartment burst open, and what happened next was unthinkable. In a brutal and frenzied outburst, Michael Ormondy launched a savage attack. Moving towards her aggressively, he grabbed hold of her and took her under his control. Pulling out a knife he had hidden on his person, he then stabbed Rebecca again and again, relentlessly plunging the knife into her defenseless body. In an act of evil personified, he sank the blade into the woman he professed to care for 27 separate times. Not slashes, not wounds of hesitation, deep, deliberate stabs that punctured her chest, her neck, her torso. She tried to fight back. Defensive wounds later showed she had raised her hands, trying to block the blade. But the onslaught didn't stop. Rebecca fled into the corridor outside her flat, bleeding, gasping, screaming, "I've been stabbed," and pleading for help, not knowing that the police were on their way, as her friend Faye had immediately called the police. Neighbours opened their doors and watched in horror as she collapsed, her body smeared in blood, life slipping away second by second. As they tried to help, she told them, "My fella stabbed me." Paramedics arrived and she was rushed to hospital, but it was already too late. Rebecca died from catastrophic blood loss before she could even be stabilised. Hours later and miles away, police were scouring the streets of Liverpool when they found him, Michael Ormondy, walking calmly along a canal towpath. He had discarded his mobile phone in the water after making a disturbing call to the police. "I'm the one who did it. I'm the one who did it in self-defense. The police are at my flat now. If they touch my dogs, I'm going to start killing police officers. One by one, I'm going to start shooting if anything happens to my dogs. I'll start killing one by one. My dogs are my babies. She tried to set me up. What happens? She calls me in and fucking stabs me. I'm gonna go now and start killing everyone. I promise. I'm going to start killing people. I've got a suicide vest and I blow everyone up. I've got nothing to lose now. I'm gonna blow myself up. I'm gonna blow everyone up. I swear to God, anyone comes near me, I blow everyone up. I'm not arsed. Come round. Send fucking whatever. My life's over. Look what's happened. It was clear when police arrived he had tried to cover his tracks, but the blood still on his clothing, the cut to his hand and his eerie silence told officers everything they needed to know. He was arrested on the spot.
Hands on your head! Walk towards me, slowly!
I'll go taser.
Contact.
Turn him round, drop him on his knees.
Turn and face the wall, do it now! Okay, stand still. Go onto your knees.
Go on your knees.
Go on your knees, mate.
Go onto your knees.
Go forward, mate.
In custody, Ormandy claimed it was self-defence. He said Rebecca had attacked him, that he'd merely reacted and that she must have stabbed herself. But the evidence painted a far darker story. There was no forced entry, no signs of a struggle consistent with his version. What police had instead was a woman who had been hunted, a woman stabbed so many times even seasoned investigators struggled to understand how she was still alive long enough to call out for help. When Ormandy's trial began at Liverpool Crown Court in October 2025, jurors heard every grim detail. How he had put on a bulletproof vest before leaving his house, how he'd come not in fear but in fury, and how Rebecca, unaware, had tried to protect herself with her bare hands. Throughout the trial, Ormandy remained cold. He never showed remorse. He doubled down on his claims of self-defence, despite overwhelming forensic evidence. The pathologist testified that many of Rebecca's wounds were defensive. Her fingers, her arms, cut as she tried to grab the blade or push him away, and the fatal wounds, the ones that pierced her internal organs, left no room for doubt. This was not a struggle. This was an execution. On October 16, 2025, the jury returned after deliberating. Their verdict, guilty of murder. In sentencing, the judge spared no words. He told Ormandy his actions were calculated, ruthless and utterly unjustifiable. And then he handed down the sentence, life imprisonment with a minimum term of 24 years behind bars. That's 24 years before he could ever be considered for release. Judge Andrew Menery, KC, said Ormandy was a deeply unpleasant and very dangerous man, and that there was no guarantee that you will be released at any particular time. Michael's reaction said it all. He sat there with a smirk on his face like a remorseless clown. As the sentence was read out, he reportedly smiled, clapped and shouted, "Come on, Cloud 9, I know where yous all live," in response to cheers from Rebecca's family. Rebecca's family sat in bewilderment in the courtroom. Her mother cried. Her siblings looked hollowed out. There was no sentence long enough, no justice deep enough to bring her back. But one thing was certain. The man who murdered her in cold blood would now have to spend what would hopefully be the rest of his life in prison. It was a quiet Sunday afternoon in South Ockenden, Essex, and the Christmas season had just begun. 5-year-old Lincoln Button was home with his mother Claire in their small flat on Windstar Drive. To neighbours, it was just another December day, the kind where families wrapped presents and children watched cartoons on the sofa. But behind the closed curtains of that home, a storm was brewing. Lincoln was a happy, affectionate little boy, bright, funny and gentle, with a fascination for toy trains and animals. Everyone said he adored his mother, and up until that afternoon, Claire Button was seen as a loving parent, struggling perhaps, but devoted to her son. What no one knew was that Claire's mind had been spiralling for weeks. Diagnosed with depression and anxiety, she'd stopped sleeping properly, and in the days leading up to the tragedy, she'd confided to doctors that she was hearing voices, harsh, commanding voices that told her she was a bad mother, that her son would be better off gone. That morning, Claire called the NHS helpline. She told the operator she felt suicidal. She said she needed help urgently, but she was told an ambulance could take several hours to arrive. It was a delay that would cost a child his life. By mid-afternoon, something inside Claire broke. Around 3 p.m, she went into the living room where Lincoln was playing. The boy looked up and smiled at her, his mother, unaware of the dark thoughts racing through her head. Claire later told police that in that moment, the voice in her mind grew louder. It told her, "You have to do it. You have to go through with it." In a single devastating act, Claire picked up a pillow from the sofa and pressed it over Lincoln's face. The small boy struggled at first, but Claire held firm. Within seconds, Lincoln stopped moving. His body went still. The flat fell silent, except for Claire's sobs. Moments later, she called 999, her voice trembling as she told the operator she was not well. When police and paramedics arrived, they found her sitting on the floor beside Lincoln's lifeless body. Nearby, on the table, were 2 handwritten notes. One read, "Do not resuscitate." The other was a short message to her husband, filled with despair. Despite frantic attempts to revive Lincoln, paramedics could not save him. The 5-year-old was pronounced dead at the scene. His cause of death was listed as smothering. In the hours that followed, police sealed off the flat. Detectives described the scene as heartbreaking. Lincoln's toys were still scattered around the living room, his half-eaten lunch still on the counter, and in the midst of it all sat a mother, broken, muttering to herself, "The voices made me do it." When questioned, Claire told detectives she had been hearing a voice, what she described as an evil command, urging her to kill her son and then herself. She said she never wanted to hurt Lincoln, that she believed they would be together in heaven. But prosecutors saw something else, a conscious, deliberate act. They argued that Claire had time to stop, time to think and choose not to. She had smothered Lincoln calmly, quietly, and even written those notes before calling emergency services. At Basildon Crown Court, the trial began in October 2025. For 8 days, jurors heard the painful details of Claire's mental health history, her calls for help, and the devastating final moments of Lincoln's life. Claire's defense team argued that she was suffering from diminished responsibility, that her mental illness had clouded her judgment so severely she could not be guilty of murder. But the prosecution told the jury that Claire understood exactly what she was doing. She pressed the pillow to Lincoln's face and kept it there until he stopped breathing. That, they said, was intent. On October 16, 2025, the jury returned after deliberation. The foreman stood, voice steady, and delivered their verdict: guilty of murder. Claire Button, who had already pleaded guilty to manslaughter but denied intent, hung her head as the verdict was read. Across the courtroom, members of her family sobbed quietly. The next day, October 17, 2025, judge passed sentence. The courtroom was silent as described the crime as one of the most shocking acts a parent can commit. He acknowledged her mental illness, but told her, "You knew what you were doing. You understood that by placing that pillow over your son's face, you were ending his life." He then sentenced her to life imprisonment with a minimum term of 9 years before she can apply for parole. As officers led her away, Claire whispered that she was sorry, but for Lincoln's family, no apology could bridge the loss. In that small Essex flat, on what should have been an ordinary December afternoon, a child who loved trains, bedtime stories and cuddles was taken by the one person who was supposed to protect him. And though Claire claimed the voices in her head made her do it, the court decided otherwise, that it wasn't madness alone, but murder. It was a cold Monday afternoon, February the 3rd, 2025, at All Saints Catholic High School in Sheffield. The bell had just rung for lunch and students filled the courtyard with chatter, laughter and the scraping sound of trainers against wet tarmac. For most, it was just another ordinary school day. But for one 15-year-old boy, that day had been planned in his mind from the moment he woke up. His name was Muhammad Umar Khan. He was a quiet, often withdrawn student, not the type that drew attention. But lately, Khan had become obsessed with another boy, Harvey Wilgoose, also 15. By all accounts, Harvey was everything a good student should be: polite, popular, well liked by teachers and calm. He and Khan had once been friends, but over time that friendship had soured. There were whispers of insults exchanged, rumours spread, arguments over social media, the kind of petty teenage drama that usually fades with time. But not for Khan. For weeks he'd been stewing in resentment. He believed Harvey was mocking him, laughing at him behind his back. It became an obsession, one that grew darker every day. That morning before heading to school, Khan did something chilling. He picked up a 13cm serrated hunting knife from his home, tucked it into his blazer pocket and set off for school. CCTV would later show him walking calmly through the gates with the weapon concealed against his side. When he reached the courtyard, he spotted Harvey with a group of friends. Harvey had no idea what was coming. He didn't see the knife. He didn't know that Khan had already decided how the day would end. Around 12:15 p.m, lunchtime was nearly over. As the crowd thinned, Khan approached Harvey. Witnesses later said the two boys exchanged a few words. No shouting, no warning. And then, without hesitation, Khan pulled out the knife and drove it straight into Harvey's chest. The blade pierced Harvey's heart. Then, as the boy staggered back, gasping, Khan struck again, a second deeper thrust, this time to the abdomen. The entire attack lasted less than 10 seconds. Students screamed. One teacher later described the scene as chaos and disbelief. Harvey stumbled backwards, clutching his chest. The colour drained from his face. Within seconds he collapsed onto the concrete, blood pooling beneath his school uniform. Friends rushed to his side. Teachers sprinted across the courtyard, shouting for ambulances. Staff performed CPR as paramedics arrived, but the wounds were catastrophic. Within a minute, Harvey had gone into cardiac arrest from massive blood loss. At 12:30 p.m, doctors pronounced him dead at the scene. Khan didn't run. He didn't try to escape. Instead, he stood there, the knife still in his hand. A teacher yelled at him to drop it, and finally he did. As he was restrained by staff, he muttered just 4 words: "I can't control it." He was arrested on the spot and taken into custody. When questioned, Khan claimed he hadn't meant to kill Harvey. He said he'd lost control, that he'd been bullied for months and that the stabbing was an explosion of fear and frustration. But detectives found evidence that told a very different story. At trial, prosecutors showed CCTV footage from that morning. Khan standing by the school gates, knife hidden under his coat, waiting for Harvey. They produced statements from students who said Khan had refused to hand the knife over when friends told him to just drop it. One even recalled Khan saying he would get him back that day. Prosecutors argue this wasn't an act of panic. It was premeditation. The knife wasn't a weapon of convenience. It was brought from home, hidden and carried into school with one purpose. At Sheffield Crown Court, the trial opened in August 2025. Jurors watched in silence as the events of that day were pieced together. Every small detail painted the same picture: a boy who had come to school ready to kill. Khan sat motionless in the dock, sometimes crying quietly as the court heard about Harvey's final moments, how his friends had begged him to hold on, how teachers had pressed their hands against his wound, trying to stop the bleeding. On August 8, 2025, after deliberating for several hours, the jury reached their verdict: guilty of murder. The courtroom was silent. Khan covered his face and sobbed as the foreman read the words aloud. Harvey's parents, sitting just a few feet away, stared at the floor, tears streaming down their cheeks. 2 months later, on October 22nd, 2025, Khan returned to court for sentencing. Mr. Justice Spencer looked down at the teenager and delivered words that echoed through the courtroom. "This was not an accident. You brought a knife to school. You waited for your victim. And in a moment of revenge, you took an innocent life." Khan wept as he was sentenced to life imprisonment with a minimum term of 16 years before he can apply for parole. He'll spend the rest of his youth and much of his adulthood behind bars. Harvey's family later released a statement describing their son as a kind, gentle boy who loved music and always tried to see the best in people. And perhaps that's what makes this tragedy so haunting. 2 boys, both just 15, walked into school that morning. Only one would ever walk out again. It was a warm August evening in 2019 and the quiet village of Warringstown in County Down moved at its usual small town rhythm. Cars hummed through Main Street. A few people wandered into the Shell filling station for snacks or cigarettes. Nothing felt out of place until 7 p.m. when a BMW 5 Series rolled slowly onto the forecourt. At the wheel was 54-year-old Michael McKeown, a man whose name already carried weight in Northern Ireland's criminal underworld. He'd spent years on the fringes of organised crime in Lurgan, smuggling, debt disputes and violent feuds that never really went away. Only 12 days earlier, he had walked out of prison after serving time for handling stolen goods. He was trying to keep a low profile, or so it seemed. But for someone like McKeown, old enemies never forget. He parked beside the pumps, got out and wandered casually into the shop. CCTV captured him chatting briefly with the cashier, buying a few snacks and a drink. He looked relaxed, maybe even relieved to be back in the world. Outside, twilight was settling, but in the shadows beyond the pumps, another car had just pulled in. It was a grey Volkswagen Passat, engine idling, 2 men inside. They had been waiting. They knew Malcolm's routines, knew this was where he'd stop most evenings. The plan was simple, brutal and professional. When Malcolm stepped back outside, the evening air was still warm. He opened the door to his BMW, put the bag on the passenger seat and slid behind the wheel. The moment he sat down, gunfire erupted. Witnesses later said the sound was deafening. 6, maybe 7 rapid cracks that echoed across the petrol station like fireworks. But these weren't fireworks, they were .40 caliber handgun rounds, fired from only a few feet away. 2 bullets smashed through the driver's window, another tore into Malcolm's shoulder, one struck him directly in the head. CCTV footage later played in court showed him lurching forward over the steering wheel before going completely still. His blood sprayed on the dashboard. The shooters didn't hesitate. They fired again through the window, ensuring there was no chance of survival. Within seconds the gunmen fled. The grey Passat screeched away from the station and disappeared down the Lurgan road, leaving nothing but silence and the faint smell of petrol. Seconds later, 2 teenage boys pulled into the same forecourt. They spotted the BMW engine still running, lights on. As they approached, one of them screamed. Malcolm McKeown was slumped lifeless over the wheel, with his blood collecting in the footwell of his car. Paramedics arrived fast, but it was hopeless. Malcolm had taken at least 6 bullets, 1 to the temple. The police sealed off the scene, floodlights washing the forecourt in sterile white as detectives collected shell casings and grainy CCTV stills. One officer would later describe it as a calculated and cold-blooded execution. The investigation, Operation Blackthorn, was launched that same night. Detectives from the PSNI's major investigation team scoured hours of camera footage, tracking the killer's escape route through nearby towns. Within days, the burnt-out shell of the grey Passat was found dumped in Craigavon. Inside lay gloves, traces of DNA and gunshot residue. Phone data, surveillance logs and eyewitness statements began pointing to two familiar names. Jake O'Brien, 31, from Rectory Road in Lurgan, and Andrew Martin, 30, from Bridge Street in Banbridge. Both had long-standing connections to local crime gangs. Both were known to carry firearms, and both had vanished the week after the killing. Over the next few years, the case wound its way through forensic analysis and extradition hearings. Then, in 2025, it finally reached the courtroom. At Antrim Crown Court, prosecutors laid out the full sequence of events. The judge called it a planned assassination, reminiscent of a terrorist ambush. The men had studied Malcolm's patterns, chosen their spot and struck without warning or mercy. The ballistic evidence matched weapons linked to other organised crime shootings across Northern Ireland. When questioned, both O'Brien and Martin denied murder. They claimed they had no reason to kill Malcolm, that they'd been set up. But the forensic trail told another story. Gunshot residue was found on their clothing and CCTV placed them together near the filling station minutes before the killing. The jury didn't take long to decide. In the summer of 2025, both men were found guilty of murder. On the morning of October 6, 2025, Judge Fowler returned to a packed courtroom for sentencing. He stared across the dock at the two defendants, expressionless, heads bowed, and told them what they had done was a carefully orchestrated ambush carried out in broad daylight, leaving a community terrorised and a family destroyed. Then came the sentences. Jake O'Brien was given life in prison with a minimum term of 26 years, and Andrew Martin to serve life with a minimum term of 24 years. Both were also handed concurrent 10-year sentences for possessing the guns used in the attack. Outside court, a PSNI spokesperson summed it up bluntly. This was no spur-of-the-moment killing, it was a professional execution. At this point, I want to express my deepest sympathies and condolences to the friends and family of all of the victims we have spoken about in today's video. May they all rest in peace. On that note, if you have gotten this far in the video and want to watch more videos from our channel, why not try the video on screen now, where I discuss 21 of the most heinous, evil and dangerous Scottish murderers sentenced for their crimes in 2025. And as always, thank you for watching, and I'll see you in the next one when it'll once again be time for more true crime.